Namaste. It is my pleasure to welcome our many viewers, not only in Britain, but around the world, and to welcome our chair for tonight's Manthan, Sachin Nandha. Sachin is the CEO of Pillbox Capital, a UK-based private equity firm. He has a doctorate in political philosophy and has a keen interest in the study of liberty and liberalism. He is also the international coordinator for Vichar Manthan. Tonight, he will be our guide as we explore creating wealth sustainably. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, some background about Vichar Manthan. Vichar Manthan, or VM, is a platform that engages in open dialogue with both game changers and renowned institutions. We examine the issues facing modern society through a Hindu civilizational lens. At Vichar Manthan's Sustainable Narratives Conference, we want to explore the stories we have been telling ourselves as a society, stories which shape how we experience ourselves and the world in which we live. These narratives shape the behavior of individuals and institutions alike. We want to examine the most prevalent stories of our time and put them on the dock in light of sustainability. For more information or to invest in ideas that matter, please click the link in the video description below. Without further ado, I would like to hand you over to our chair. Sachin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sapna ji. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. So for all those who are viewing us, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you are around the world. I know that a lot of you have subscribed to listen to this conversation and this panel discussion, where we will be discussing how to create wealth sustainably. And of course, we are, I think, just past the midway through this conference, and I know that I've managed to pick up some of the previous conversations that we've been having here, and they've been riveting, they've been fantastic. There's been a lot of insightful content and ideas flowing through, and I hope we will continue to do that. With me tonight, I have a pleasure of talking to three fantastic economists. With me, first and foremost, is Dr. Jamie Whyte. Jamie, who has spoken on this platform before, is an economist. He is the ex-head of research at the Institute of Economic Affairs, a London-based think tank. He has written several books, including a book called What a Load of Blair, and he's a liberal economist and a proficient writer. Next, we have Harsh Gupta. Harsh is from India. Harsh is an economist. He is the chief investment officer at the Ashika Group in India. And also he's the author of a book called Modinomics, which looks at some of the economic policies of the Modi government in India. And so, and the final speaker is Eric Lonergan. Eric spoke on this platform last night in a fireside chat with me. So some of you will be familiar with him. For those of you who are not, Eric is a macro hedge fund manager, and he's the author of a book that's just recently come out, or the co-author of a book that's recently just come out called Angrynomics, which I had the pleasure of talking to him about last night. So all three of you gentlemen, welcome to Sustainable Narratives. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Sachin. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So what I want to do is I want to get straight into it. What I want to do for tonight's framework for all our viewers is that I'm going to ask all three of our panelists to open up and make some opening remarks for no more than 10 minutes. And then we are going to get into the panel discussion. And then at some point we'll be opening up, and I would love to have as many questions from our viewers and our audience from all over the world about the vast variety of topics that we will cover to do with economics. So I welcome questions. I'll be receiving them through the portal I have over here, and I'll be happy to transmit as many questions as I possibly can to our speakers. So please do do submit your questions. So without further ado, Jamie, can I get you to open up the floor with some opening remarks about the why liberty and free markets are so important?
Thank you, Sachin. Humans have been around for about 500,000 years. It's debatable, but a long time. And yet, almost all the wealth that's been created in the entire history of mankind, it has been created in the last 200 years. That's a tiny fraction of the time we've been around. Up until about 1800, almost everybody on Earth, except for a handful of kings and queens and lords and all that kind of potentates, almost everybody lived at a level, lived a subsistence kind of a lifestyle. They lived on an income that we today consider to be absolute poverty, about $2 a day in US dollars. And then that started to change around 1800. Incomes rose between 1800 and 1900 from about, in the UK, which was the richest country in the world to start with, they rose from about £2,000 a year as the GDP per person, up to about 5,000 by 1920. And another 100 years on from there, and we're up to £32,000 per person. It is, I think modern people don't understand what an extraordinary kind of historic event the last 200 years have been. It has totally changed the way humans live, massively for the better. And of course, most of this progress has been in the West up until recently, but now it's spread around the world. In the last 40 years, there's been a lot of catching up happening, China and India being the most notable examples. So what we need to understand if we want to know about having, how do we have sustainable economic growth is, well, what happened back then? Why did things change in that way? And how do we sustain it? Now, the answer, economists talk a lot about things like efficiency, efficient allocations of capital. Are markets really efficient in the way they're supposed to be and so on? But efficiency really isn't what transformed the world 200 years ago. There wasn't a more efficient allocation of bits of wood and hammers and nails and all that kind of thing. What changed was that there was an explosion of innovation. Humans started finding, or at least certain humans, a certain part of the world, started finding new ways of doing things, much better ways of doing things. This was essentially the Industrial Revolution. And it just built and built and built. So it began, the most famous development was the mechanical loom, way of weaving that was automated in a sense, mechanical, and it's much more efficient. But this was just the beginning. There was widespread adoption of industrial production techniques. It's massively reduced the cost of manufactured goods, such as clothing, improving people's standard of living. You've got transport methods improving, which allowed markets to be opened up all across continents and around the world. You had huge improvements in hygiene, in sanitation, sewage systems, and medicine started to be invented, new medicines. And of course, so therefore health improved massively, life expectancy. And that feeds on itself, that improves things further because healthier people are more productive. And then we get a revolution in communications. So we've got the telephone, got the internet, now we've got Zoom, we're doing this through Zoom. And we also got massive gains in what economists call human capital. Basically, people became more knowledgeable. Everybody, you get mass literacy and numeracy. And again, that feeds on itself, that improves things. We get further developments. So it's a story not of efficiency so much as of innovation. And if we want to sustain this amazing progress, we really need to sustain innovation. So I want to talk about in this opening talk what's needed for innovation. Well, first we should look at what happened back then, back around the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. this is disputed. It's a topic of debate amongst historians, but they're mainly arguing about which elements were more important and less important. I don't want to get involved in that game. I'm not a historian, but I think it's worth mentioning the important developments that led to this. And you can talk about how important they are, but I think they all had a role to play. I just want to talk about three. The first one is what you might call the intellectual backdrop. So just prior to the Industrial Revolution, there had been the scientific revolution, starting with Copernicus's theory that the sun orbited, it was in the center of the solar system and the Earth orbited it, and kind of going through, that's 1543, carrying through to Newton's work on physics in his book Principia Mathematica, which was 1687. That was the period known as the scientific revolution. And that spawned what's come to be known as the Enlightenment, which was in a sense the application of this new way of thinking that could be seen in the scientific revolution, which I'll get to, in a broader range, a wider area of topics, thinking about mankind, politics, all range of topics. What was that new way of thinking? Well, it was to a large extent the rejection of authority in inquiry. So if I want to understand the world, I don't ask the Pope, and the Pope can't tell me. I interrogate reality. And how do you do that? Well, you do that through empirical science. And I won't bore you with what that means. Everyone will have a rough idea. But that was a revolution. And it was part of the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution because it led to scientific advance that was then used in the innovations, in the economic and production innovations. So that was the intellectual backdrop. Another important factor, I think, is that the population had grown a lot just before the Industrial Revolution. In the 18th century, so from 1700 up to 1800 in the UK, the population almost doubled. It went from 5.5 million up to 9 million. Now, why does that lead to innovation? Well, there are two reasons. One's very simple. If you've got more people, there are more people to have good ideas. I mean, it is just as simple as that up to a point. But there's another important matter, which is that you get more population density. So people started, because of agricultural improvements, this is what led to this population increase. You could support more people off a given amount of land, and it allowed people to live in cities. And when people live in cities, they meet each other more, and this sparks innovation. Matt Ridley, a British economist who's just published, or a biologist actually, he's just published a book called How Innovation Works. For a while, he's been saying that one of the ways innovation comes about is by what he calls ideas having sex. So you've got ideas, people with independent sets of expertise and separate ideas, and they somehow come together, and these ideas interact in a way that produces new ideas. So the new ideas are the kind of offspring of the old ideas having sex. And that's much more likely to happen when you have population density and people can interact. The other thing that happened was that there was a cultural shift around that time, which was that people started to think that it was okay, it was a perfectly good way of life, and a decent person might be involved in commerce. Commerce had been frowned upon by the Christian church in Europe traditionally, and that started to change. And the economist Deirdre McCloskey reckons that this is the main cause of the explosion of innovation in the Industrial Revolution. It's what she calls bourgeois dignity. Why did ideas about this change? That's an interesting question. I won't spend too long on it. The explanation I favor is from an ex-colleague of mine, a chap called Steve Davies. And he says that in a large empire, a kind of like China was at the time, where it's a big and powerful country with a small ruling elite, or even, an emperor. The authorities want to stifle innovation, because they're sitting at the top of something and they're enjoying the status quo, and they do not want the status quo changed. It's not in their interests for things to change, so they stifle innovation. By contrast, if you're the ruler of a small and relatively weak state, you're more worried about being attacked from outside. And Europe was like that. It was full of such states at the time when the Industrial Revolution began. And Steve Davis' theory is that the rulers of those small countries encouraged innovation as a way of making technological progress, which would allow them to be more militarily effective and defend themselves. So that's an interesting theory. But whatever caused this change, the change did happen. So those are the kind of preconditions that brought about the Industrial Revolution. Now, I need to relate this to economic liberty, which I'm kind of here to defend, and say that it's very important for sustainable economic growth, sustainable economic progress. So let me now explain why that's important by asking what we need to keep this going, to keep this amazing economic progress that we've enjoyed for 200 years going. Well, in policy areas, I think you need three things. People have got to be allowed to innovate. So it can't be banned. Now, I know it may seem crazy, but it is banned in many areas. So for example, in education, there's been very little innovation in education in Britain. One of the least innovative areas in Britain. Why? Well, you try to start a new school, teaching in a new way, following a new curriculum, you are literally not allowed to. It is regulated.
Right.
So some things are just
if you just wrap up the opening remarks. Is that okay? If you can just wrap up some of your opening remarks.
Am I going over time? I'm sorry. I'll go through more quickly. So you've got to also be able to profit from innovation. If taxes are very high, you're not going to be able to profit from innovation. So you need light regulations and low taxes. Another thing you need is for companies to be allowed to fail. If I'm trying to innovate now, I'm trying to make a profit from my innovations. If the old companies doing things old ways are bailed out by the government, then I can't get ahead. I can't take advantage of my innovation. And again, you see this happening all the time. The most notable occasion when it happened was in 2008, when all Britain's banks were bailed out, having shown that they were following very bad business practices. Finally, quickly to wrap, because I thought I had more time, we need to remain open. As I mentioned, a lot of innovation happens by people with different ideas interacting and coming up with new ideas. So we need to be open to foreign workers, open to foreign students. We need to keep globalization going. And so to end on a pessimistic note, I think you can see that the things I've mentioned, all of them are moving in the wrong direction. So regulation is getting much tougher. Taxes are going to go up. They're certainly after the COVID business. And politicians around the world are turning their backs on globalization, at least here in the West. And I think all of this bodes very ill for continued innovation, at least innovation that's gone at the rate it has over the last 200 years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that.
Apologize to Sachin for running over. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. All I'm going to do, Jamie, as punishment is I'm going to take off a few minutes of this next question I'm going to ask you really quickly, okay? So literally a few minutes to answer this one. You talked about liberty, right? And I'm going to come to in the later discussion about some of the key things that we should keep in mind as to why we've flourished so well materially and economically in the world. But liberty and equality are not good housemates, right? Because there's always some tension between liberty and equality. Just very quickly, just how do you reconcile that, right? Because one of the reasons why you get this tension is because there's inequality in the world and it's growing to some extent, at least that's the perception. So just very quickly reflect on that 2 minutes, and then I want to move on to Harsh.
Well, I don't actually believe inequality is growing, but let's pretend it is. Certainly you're right that there is a tension between the two of them, because if you allow if you have the things that I just mentioned, for example, that you can profit from your actions as an economic actor, then, and also fail, then inevitably there are going to be very different outcomes for very different people. And so the results cannot end up equal if you're going to provide economic freedom. And the goal of economic equality, it's different incomes, wages are prices in the labor market. If you were to set them all at the same level, there would be no labor market. If everything's priced the same, you don't really have a market, because you need, the prices are signals about the demand for something and the supply of it. And if you're not allowed, if you don't allow prices to carry that information, you get a horrible misallocation of resources. So I think that there are better and worse ways of trying to bring about some of the social goals that we have. So most people don't want to see people have no opportunity at birth. I think most people want there to be enough opportunity that they think it's some level is kind of morally required. That can be brought about without the goal of equality, as you might put it, after the event. So after they've acted and tried to live their life, well, some people are going to do better than others, and we've got to allow that.
Okay, thank you so much. Right, that's perfect. That's a great conduit for you, Harsh. If I can get you to reflect for the next sort of 10 minutes on, what does creating wealth sustainably for you mean? And of course, by all means, define those terms. And in what respect do you think India in particular is contributing to this story, this narrative unfolding, over the next 30 years?
Thank you so much, Sachin. It's my absolute honor to be on this panel. Thank you to the organizers of Vichar Manthan. Totally delighted to be on the same panel as Eric and Jamie. I'm the guy who does not have a PhD, so I'll probably pull least weight on this panel. And just a small correction, I have not written a book on Modinomics. I've written a lot about, many columns about Modinomics. I've given video lectures about it, but I've actually written a book on financial derivatives, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Okay, so the question is more broadly and then maybe specifically about India to 2050. So sustainable economic growth or sustainable wealth creation can be across multiple axes. It can be across sustainable in a political sense, sustainable in an economic, financial, fiscal sense itself, sustainable in an environmental sense or more broadly moral sense, though that overlaps elsewhere, and sustainable in a geopolitical sense, something that's increasingly relevant for our world. So let's begin, and there's a lot of overlap, as I mentioned. So let's begin with sustainable in an economic sense. I think one of the most important ways to make economic growth sustainable in an economic sense is to have a modern functional state. And just by virtue of my background, so I studied economics at Dartmouth College in the US. In Dartmouth, I was the co-founder of College Libertarians. But ever since I have come back to India and I'm working here, I've nuanced my views a bit more. So in the sense that I still would largely agree with Jamie, but as I suspect I would also largely agree with a lot of what Eric would say, just going through some of the book reviews that I've gone through. What I mean by that is, Jamie mentioned the Great Divergence, right? Basically 1800 to 2000, this kind of tiny Western, well, not tiny, but relatively small Western corner of the Eurasian landmass became so rich, and what kind of led to that proliferation. And he mentioned basically Smithian growth, economies of scale, innovation, the ideas he quoted McCloskey, etc. I think those are all valid reasons, but there are additional reasons. The Britain, for example, was one of the first modern states we have in 1707. Britain, basically England and Scotland united, right? So, and by virtue of being an island, it was not always in kind of land warfare with the rest of the continent. It's interesting that Japan in Asia was one of the first countries to take off for similar reasons. And then one thing which I find personally disappointing, having been a libertarian, which is not often spoken about, is the history and relevance of colonization to Britain's growth. And what I mean by that is, when Britain basically captured India, starting with Bengal being an extremely rich exporter of textiles, they were very protectionist about it in terms of tariffs, in terms of the Calico Act, in terms of suppressing Bengal, which is now in India and Bangladesh manufacturing. And they were very systematic about it throughout the 1700s and the 1800s. For example, all the Indian railways they built were based on guaranteed profit returns, et cetera, funded by the Indian taxpayers, but going to only Indian companies were not allowed, so on and so forth. So it is true that you need economies of scale for innovation, that's Smithian growth. But where did that initial leap came from? I don't think it came from 5.5 million going to 9 million. I think it came from 5.5 million going to hundreds of millions, potentially partially through colonization, becoming these markets. And what happened in the ensuing decades, if you read economic historians like Robert Allen and Prasanna and Parthasarthi, just to kind of complement the free market view, which I still think has a lot of useful advice to give us, especially on domestic market side. What happened is then the United States, for example, had 40% weighted average import tariffs throughout the 19th century. Germany had the Zollverein trade pact that had external tariffs, but internal free markets. And basically what has happened is through the world wars, first in East Asia, now with India, and hopefully soon with Africa, we are basically seeing the spread of the modern free nation state system. And I think that is the first and foremost important requirement for sustainable growth rate, because you need an activist state along with some free markets. And this simply, you have to square the circle somehow. There is no way to denuance it. So economically, I'll mention these 4 factors and quickly mention how it applies to India. So India, for example, at market exchange rates is slightly more than $2,000 per annum per capita. The US is $65,000. That's a 30x difference. So I think as Jamie kind of hinted, in the last 30, 40 years, we are now seeing the beginning of global convergence after global divergence. And I think India is one of the beneficials. So there's basically, it's another way of saying there's a long runway ahead of us in terms of converging on the per capita difference. So that's one way of understanding. More cyclically, we've kind of consolidated. We've had inflation targeting like Paul Volcker did in the US in the early 1980s. So you go through a pain of transition when your inflation falls, but interest rates nominal don't fall, and therefore real interest rates increase, and you have a short-term depression. But after that, you kind of boom. So India seems on the economic fiscal side, because of state capacity and various conservative measures taken over the last few years, well placed. And I'll quickly come back to it if I have time. Just in the interest of time, I want to rush. Then on the political and social side, what makes Indian growth or wealth creation sustainable is that India is a democracy. I think one of the reasons, one of the ways that you make a modern nation state stable, or to kind of use some fashionable lingo of these days, anti-fragile, is to be democratic. In the sense that there is a big overhang, a Damocles sword on the China story, in terms of Xi Jinping, for example, having removed the 2-term limit that was applying to him. So that era of collective leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, you can say, fine, they had no democracy, et cetera, but now there's a massive political risk that anybody has to keep in mind over and above anything else. Recently, Russia, which is kind of a borderline case, Putin had a referendum that said if the people so vote, he could remain president until 2036. So there's what happens is when you really push the system, you make up. There is a saying in Hindi, and I'm translating to English. Trees that don't bend, they break. And what happens with democracies is the tree bends. So the Indian system, I would say, for me, the India story actually started in 1977, not 1947. Big story, no doubt. Not 1991, the more well-known date of reforms. 1977 is when Indira Gandhi kind of stared at dictatorship and stared back, moved back. The first time the Congress government was voted out. I don't want to go into domestic politics here, but for me, in retrospect is always 2020, it proves the Indian democratic model was here to stay. And if you can change your rulers, you will eventually make sure you undo some mistakes. As Churchill famously said about the Americans, they always do the right thing after doing all the wrong things. And I think that also applies to India, because that's what happens in a democracy. You kind of stumble through, but you kind of know you'll reach the end goal because you won't go to any extreme. And also socially, what the Modi government in the last 6 years has done is we've gone to universal electricity access. Things which were taken for granted in the West, because nobody in living memory has heard of a national campaign to extend electricity access in the West. It's already taken for granted. Electricity access, massive infrastructure creation, both highways and rural roads, sanitation, massive sanitation creation, massive expansion of affordable housing, and now the latest program being worked on is on potable, drinkable tap water across all Indian households. by the middle of this decade. So to kind of the question you asked Jamie, like about inequality, in India, the bigger question is social mobility and opportunity, right? I mean, if you go by Gini coefficient and indexes, sure, we've gone from lower 30s in the 80s to high 30s right now, but that's still the same as the UK. And in fact, the US and China are much more. So, and by the way, global inequality is decreasing. It's inequality that's within countries that's increasing. So it's very important to understand whenever people say, oh my God, inequality is increasing, as a non-Westerner, I implicitly feel like you're not even counting other people as human beings, because for you, the story is not relevant. So that's on the social side. On the environmental side, again, nuance is required. The global kind of warming climate change debate has led to massive innovation and investment, including state investment by Germany and China, which might have been short-term wasteful from a narrow national perspective, but they've led to these new renewable technologies becoming more commercially viable for everybody. And I'm like, this is my inner libertarian coming out, I'm very cornucopian. I'm not a neo-Malthusian. Like, I do think, for example, everybody till 10 years ago was discussing peak oil supply, but now we've actually known that this peak oil demand is the problem. And even after this kind of rebound, we're still at $40 odd per barrel, right? And now people are saying solar plus wind plus storage, either battery storage or pumped hydro storage, is actually becoming commercially viable without any subsidies. It's just a matter of a few years before it takes off and you have a decentralized grid. So that further makes India's kind of growth very, very sustainable going forward, because growth at a very fundamental level is about having more energy access per person. If you can just move things around, I mean, this goes around in circles. From like 1920 to 1970, you had more energy intensive innovation. Like 1972 was the last time we went to the moon. But 1972 to now is probably when we did a lot more on data and bytes and the internet and so on and so forth. And one of the reasons we have secular stagnation, if you go by, Martin Wolf or Larry Summers, is there's not enough demand. And, there's we can go into that, into MMT and Green New Deal and et cetera, et cetera. But I think there is a tipping point which is coming when a lot of these renewable energies will become so commercially viable that there will be massive demand both across so-called developed and so-called emerging economies. So that's on the environmental side. Another angle on the environmental side is, artificial lab meat, which allows you to remain vegetarian if you are so for ethical or religious reasons, at the same time contribute to the environment. And, like a lot of these companies have insane valuations in the US. They might be slightly overvalued right now, but the point is the story is catching on.
Yeah, Harsh, can I get you to wrap up? And
the final point in terms of sustainability is geopolitical, right? I mean, with what with the pandemic and with trade, you want more trade. I agree with Jamie, you want more globalization, but you have to be cognizant about who you are strengthening through that. And clearly, in retrospect, Western strategists are thinking that allowing the entry of China into WTO in 2001 may have been a mistake. So in terms of, can we perhaps have a league of democracies in terms of trading, so that what is happening right now is because of China, all countries are in general going back on globalization. Whereas, for example, India does not have a problem to have a trade pact with the UK or Canada or Australia. It has a problem with the kind of subsidized 10 times economies of scale manufacturing base of China, which does not allow India's industrialization to take off. And then you end up with debates of currency depreciation and import substitution. So right. I think we need to kind of finesse that. So I'll just stop there in terms of sustainability.
Thank you so much. That was very dense, very packed. We're going to definitely try and unpack some of that in our conversation later on. Just quickly, Harshda, before I move on to Eric, and really briefly, if you can, and I'll certainly pick this up again later on, which is, look, India obviously, as you rightly said, is just waking up, right? It's got a long way to go. It's a long runway, as you rightly said, I think. But, Brazil has been there. South Africa kind of went there. Russia kind of went there, and they all hit a middle income trap, right? So very, very briefly, and then we'll unpack it later. Do you think, well, what are the risks of India hitting this middle income trap anyway? In the sense that all this growth has only come from its top 100 million, and really the other 900 million odd people or more, I should say, kind of are not really integrated into the wider economy? What would you say?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm not even sure empirically that a middle income trap exists. A lot of people speak about it. There was a good Economist piece which kind of doubted the middle income trap. The countries you mentioned, like Brazil and Russia, are basically commodity exporting countries effectively today. Brazil has terrible infrastructure. Russia has political issues that I mentioned. And because of that, they have what is known as a Dutch disease, right? Their export of commodities leads to their manufacturing effectively becoming uncompetitive. India in a way, not being blessed by natural resources in a way, or at least on a per capita basis, is luckier because we have been forced to kind of pull up our boots and bootstrap ourselves, in fact, make our own boots, as Indira Gandhi once mentioned. And therefore, and not only that, unlike the East Asian developmental state, and India is basically like a swing state when it comes to economic ideology, halfway between the present day East Asian developmental state and the Anglo-American Saxon model. What we are doing is doubling down on manufacturing exports, or at least manufacturing domestic consumption right now, but we also had services exports, especially in IT. So I think that's a much longer runway because people automatically upskill themselves. The lower level jobs kind of get automated out. So our real effective exchange rate does not go up and down with the price of oil or iron or so on and so forth. So we are not a classic colonial commodity export kind of player. And therefore, I think our growth, even if you look at our population numbers or GDP numbers, you can just go to Google, the graphs are always much smoother than they are for Brazil and Russia. So I'm not sure even those countries are hitting middle income trap, but India, by having this kind of free market economy, like China might hit a problem with too much inputs and therefore they've reached a certain level. Now they can't diversify their economy into creative areas, for example. They've tried to kind of do that by having a great internet firewall. India is kind of copying that, but India already has a lot of creative economies. So I'm definitely biased here, but by virtue of not being a colonial kind commodity exporter, I think it's a much smoother runway.
Right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll certainly come back to that and maybe unpack some of it. Eric, I know you've been waiting. Right, so Eric, the question for you is, look, we kind of touched on this last night, but think of it as a new audience. In some sense, our capitalist model is failing some of us. If as Harsh said, maybe not in the developing world, but certainly in the developed world, there is a lot of anger, right? There's a lot of frustration. There are people who think they're being left behind, both in the States and in the UK. Could you give us your opening remarks where you think some of the danger spots are, where this might unravel if we're not careful?
Sure, thanks, Sachin. First of all, can I just say I found both of those introductory remarks absolutely fascinating. And I would actually say, first of all, with respect to what Jamie said, and I think he gave a very brilliant description of how amazingly functional free market capitalism broadly described is, and what extraordinary benefits it's delivered. And in a sense, my only disagreement with most of what he was saying is really that, and for one of the reasons he gave, which was the doubling of the British population and how significant that was, when I look at the global population that is now involved in innovation, it is greater and has increased in size quite dramatically within the last 2 decades. And by that, I take, for example, China. I think it's one of the deepest ironies that there's now pressure on the Chinese to sort of sign up to international property rights at precisely the point in time where China is actually, in innovation and technological terms and R&D, research and development, ahead of us in many, many areas. So actually they have an incentive themselves to impose international property rights, intellectual property rights. And if anything, we would benefit from stealing some of their technology, but such is life. So I'm very, very optimistic about innovation. I think we have unprecedented levels of innovation. And I also think, and the rate of innovation, I think, is accelerating quite considerably. And I think to Jamie's point as well, and this is deeply misunderstood often, is innovation is driven by the exchange of ideas. It's exactly what he described about urbanization and people exchanging ideas and thought. And again, the kind of conventional view of economics that prescribes it in terms of efficiency is absolutely right. We thrive on the fact that we are different. right? Whereas economics actually assumes everybody's the same, in which case there'd be no point in doing anything. So I see a world that has greater ability to communicate than it's ever had before because of the internet, because of we live in an electronic age, where the entirety of the globe has kind of signed up to open free market capitalism with varying distinctions, but actually relative to the scale of what's going on, the distinctions aren't that material. There's a couple of important caveats, though. One thing is that, and this is often misunderstood by technologists in particular, who are always seeking innovation, i.e. new ideas. Actually, we could dramatically improve human well-being if we simply more effectively use the ideas we already have, right? So some of the fastest areas of growth in the world are using old technologies. They're just applying them. Okay? And I'll give you a very simple example of this. If you look at payments, in an economy like Germany. Germany is an advanced economy. You know, payments, the use of credit cards, which is a 1950s technology, is actually a growth industry today in Germany, which is fascinating, right? You are getting productivity and technological gains in payments using a 1950s technology because it's being adopted. And there are hundreds of thousands of examples where our existing societies, if we could get it right, could use existing technology to greatly better themselves, not to mention the fact that we're getting huge amounts of new innovation. Okay, so in a sense, I take that for granted. And human beings are never satisfied. We never rest on our laurels, which is another reason why we kind of continue going forward. And so I'm focused on what isn't working rather than, in a sense, what is working incredibly well. And I think the bit that isn't working are three things. One is wealth inequality. The other is global warming or environmental degradation. And the other is recessions. And I think these are global problems, and I think they affect all regions of the world. And the point about inequality is really a very simple one, which is, let's say, we could keep everything the same in our society: the rate of innovation, the rate of GDP per capita, the stock of wealth. But you could have more balanced distribution of wealth. Would that not be a better thing? I think it's self-evidently the case that it would. In other words, if we broadly take in the developed world as a generalization, something like 90% of the assets in the hands of, it's disputed, but anywhere between the top 10% to the top 1% of the population, that is, clearly we can do better than that. Surely we can do better than that. In other words, if we had a distribution that was more like 60-40 or even 80-20 or 70-30 would be an improvement and could make a huge difference. That seems to me to be kind of a self-evident truth. And I also think where there's been a lack of innovation is largely in the application of economic ideas. So I would say, rather than free market capitalism failing us, we've failed free market capitalism. So I think of markets and capitalism as something that you send off in a direction and they solve a problem for you. And a good example of that would be something like, you know, the only time in recent American history where there's been a decline in what the Americans call gas consumption or fuel, if you think of petrol consumption, was actually when you got $150 oil. So that is illustration of how powerful markets are as coordination devices. You can use prices to get huge results. And I think we can use prices, in a sense, and innovation to tackle the issue of inequality. But we can also do it to tackle the environment in dramatic ways. And I think here there is just a huge lack of ambition. And the irony is that there's extraordinary ambition in the private sector. So if you look at the achievements of what's happened with American technology in terms of electric transportation is absolutely astonishing, what's been achieved in very short periods of time. But we don't have these ambitions as nations. And so I think that is a huge failing. So I think, given the government's cost of capital at the moment, the private sector's cost of capital, I think we could make some small shifts in the incentive structure that could unleash extraordinary investment and innovation within our environment, which could make a dramatic impact to, for example, the issue of sustainable energy. If you take, for example, the UK, because of technological innovation, already we've got 25 to 30% of energy generation is wind. I see absolutely no reason why that couldn't be 70 to 100% within 5 to 6 years. That's purely a failure of ambition. And then the final point for me is recessions. And this really is where economists need to look in the mirror and ask themselves, what the hell have we been doing? Because a pandemic is not predictable, but a recession is predictable. And there should be a template, right? We shouldn't be trying to scratch our heads in the middle of the recession, arguing about what we're supposed to be doing, right? We've had a recession on average once a decade across the developed world for several centuries now. And it's actually, we've had zero innovation in how to tackle them, right? And we are relying on central banks, which is frankly a technology from, again, the 18th century. It's largely an accident of institutional history that we rely on central banks to cut interest rates. You would not design a monetary system based on central banks cutting interest rates to solve a recession if you had a blank sheet of paper. We are only doing that because those institutions were set up 200 years ago to finance governments with open market operations and to provide liquidity to banks through open market operations. So effectively, quantitative easing, all these supposed innovations are not really innovations. They're using an institutional structure from the 1800s, which has given a vast increase of responsibility, which is to manage the cycle. So the challenge, I think, for economics in the world today is absolutely not to interfere in the aspects of markets and capitalism that are hugely effective at providing solutions to our problems, but is in a sense is directing the system in the right area. And I think there are very simple, we have a huge opportunity at the moment. We're incredibly lucky because we have zero interest rates and the state can borrow for 20 years at a negative cost of capital. That's unprecedented. And the difference, the missing piece between innovation and a huge transformation of society is diffusion and investment spending. If you have an incredibly low cost of capital, it means all you need is a positive return and you should have an investment boom. So the question, in a sense, I would throw to policymakers today is exactly that. Why aren't you using your balance sheets to give a greater number of people a share in the capital base, which you can do through setting up a national wealth fund and using your balance sheet to do that? You don't have to raise any taxes. You can make a huge impact on the distribution of wealth and assets. Why aren't you accelerating through incentive structures a dramatic reinvestment in our energy infrastructure to tackle environmental degradation? And why are you not rewriting the rules of cyclical intervention to prevent recessions and or if not to prevent recessions, to prevent the harm that's caused by recessions?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And you did that in time. Well done. That was good. A quick question for you, though, Eric, before we kind of get into the kind of our own manthan here. By the way, manthan, for those of you who didn't know, Sanskrit meaning churning. So before we get into a churn, what are the challenges, some of the axioms that, you get told in sort of the kindergarten of economics is, markets are completely rational and, markets can eradicate dogma. Eric, is that the case? Do you buy that markets can eradicate dogma? And if so, how? Just very quickly.
Well, the markets are complex, but one of the aspects of markets, which I think is underappreciated, is that markets are incompatible ultimately with nationalism or tribalism. And this is where I think one of the markets are a very, very, can have the ethical force for conflict resolution. So in a sense, I think human beings can respond to difference in two ways. They can either say, you're different to me, so we're going to go to war, or they can say, you're different to me, so we should trade. There's a great quote from the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who said, in order to trade, you must first lay down your spear. And you can even find that in Marx, actually. Marx recognized that capitalism would destroy nationalism. Although I actually think today there's a very, very intriguing tension, particularly if you look in the political spectrum, that the advocates very often of free markets are now also advocating forms of tribalism, but they can sense there's a kind of cognitive problem for them, because you can't simultaneously believe in free trade and also believe in nationalism, or indeed actually believe in the merits of exchange.
Okay, all right, wonderful. Right, guys. So I mean, thank you for those opening remarks. I mean, we covered a huge topography there. of some economic ideas, and that was the whole point, right? I kind of wanted you to traverse, broadly speaking, where we are and where some of our challenges. So we've acknowledged, right, that sort of let's not get carried away here. We've got a lot of good things going for us, right? And we are in a pretty good time in the sense that we have the opportunity to innovate or opportunity to do something, that will take our societies to the next level. We're kind of at some sense, from all three of you, the way you spoke, I sense that all three of you feel that we're on the cusp of something really interesting that is about to manifest. Now, whether it's positive or negative, that's a different issue. Nobody can predict that. But I sense that from your tones. And, I want to kind of jump into some questions and some themes that came out of what all of you guys were saying. Jamie, you right off the bat said, look, you don't even think there is any inequality, or inequality is not a problem, right? You kind of set that off the bat when I asked you a question about liberty and equality as this tension, and you kind of said, well, look, inequality may not even be that much of an issue. Eric, you clearly said that actually what you've got is you've got 10% hoarding, whatever it was, a vast amounts of assets, at least in the UK, I think you were mentioning, and therefore that's a problem, and we'd prefer to get it to 60-40 or something, as you said, I think, and I'm just kind of quoting you there. So I just want to clarify that firstly. Is there a complete contradiction between both of you just said, or did you mean something very different? So Jamie, I want you to reflect on that, and then Eric, if you jump back in on that.
Sure.
The reason I said I think the inequality issue is exaggerated, there are two reasons, really. One is the point that Harsh made, that if you look internationally, globally, it's declining. So the difference between the incomes in developing countries and rich countries has got smaller. So that's a decline. And the second reason is related to that, which is that consumption has diminishing marginal utility, right? So if you're really, really poor and your income goes up by $1,000 a year, that makes a huge difference to your welfare. That you're so much better off. If you were on 2,000 a year and now you're on 3, that's a big difference. If you're on 100,000 and now you're on 101,000, that's almost no difference. So what's happened is that as aggregate wealth, as wealth generally goes up, because each extra dollar is worth less in terms of welfare, the differences are getting smaller. So I mean, just to make this very vivid, if I am a billionaire and I double my wealth, I'm no better off in a certain sense, because I could already have anything I wanted. So as the rich get richer, they're not really getting any richer. They've got more money, but they're not getting any richer. They're not getting any better off. As the poor get richer, they're getting a lot better off. And what we've seen in the last 40 years is massive increases in the wealth of the poor, and that has diminished inequality in terms of welfare.
Can I sort of caricature what you've just said, and then shoot me down if it's wrong? The caricature you just said is, look, guys, don't worry about the billionaires. Let them double, triple in value. Don't worry about that, because they can't consume anymore anyway, right? All they're going to end up doing is recycling their money back into the economy. But hey, look at all the good that's going on in the rest of the world and how everybody's getting a little bit wealthier. Would that be a caricature of what your position is actually? Don't worry about the fact that the billionaire just got now 2 billion. Whereas
I'm completely
Eric,
happy with that.
Are you comfortable with that, Eric?
So what would I say? There's a couple of points I'd make. I mean, I think the facts are reasonably clear. So it's not that rewarding, I don't think, necessarily to talk about it in the aggregate. So it's absolutely the case that inequality between, say, if you took China at the aggregate and America at the aggregate, relative inequality has declined. Absolutely, that is correct. The simple fact, though, is that within the developed world, there is huge inequality of wealth and huge inequality of income. And to some extent, I think Jamie's just given a reason why, if you can do something about that, it is hugely beneficial, right? Because in a sense, you've got one family on an income of 200,000 and another family on an income of 20, you could, if you can transfer 5,000 from the family on 200,000 to the family on 20,000. As Jamie said, you make no difference to one person's standard of living and huge difference to the others. So it's almost a truism, actually, that if you can, without interfering with how your system is functioning, the better your distribution. It's a truism that it's a better outcome. So in a sense, now, as for the kind of billionaires, again, I think one can slightly miss the point here. There's two ways to view that issue. First of all, I would say that there are genuine issues about money in politics. There are genuine influences of questions about how much influence we want individuals to have. Now, you might say it's a competitive space. I think there's a very contentious empirical question. But again, it doesn't seem highly functional as societies that we have potentially vast concentrations of wealth in a very small number of people, right? Because that implies huge power to interfere with the media, communication, beliefs, fund ideas, etc. One has to be very careful about that. But that's a problematic area, right? But I think the simpler point to me is, let's say you take 40–50% of the population that has virtually no assets. I want them to have assets, because one of the costs of a free market system is a high degree of uncertainty and risk in daily life. So there's a tension, right? Because we like innovation because it improves. We like technological progress because our lives get better. But it also increases huge uncertainty, right? So if my skills become redundant because of innovation, it creates uncertainty in my life. If the business that I'm working for fails, it creates unemployment and huge uncertainty in my life. And human beings don't like that. We actually like, we want to improve, but we don't want a huge amount of uncertainty and risk, most people. And one way you can solve that or provide people with insurance is to give them more assets. Okay. Or for people to have more assets, right? So so again, I think there's a lot of kind of naive descriptions of risk taking. You know, most entrepreneurs, and some are taking some huge risks. The vast majority within the developed world aren't taking much risk at all, because they actually have extraordinary fallback positions. And I see this, loads and loads of people doing huge innovation in Greater London at the moment. Their fallback positions are very, very good one, right? Because they have assets or they have hugely high degrees of human capital. So effectively, I'm much more worried about all of the people who are affected by huge economic change, whose skills become redundant, who are affected by recessions. They have no protection with assets. It would be there would be huge increases in human welfare if we could give 30–40% of GDP in assets to people who currently don't have assets. And I think that's actually very easy to do.
Okay, all right, that's super interesting. Okay, Harsh, just very quickly, right, on the same issue before I move on. India, I mean, when I travel around India, I know really over the first time I went to India, really, I was 25, backpacking. And I go to India now, it's like a different India, and I'm not that old, right? So within a short space of time, India has transformed. But what you do see in India is the inequality of wealth distribution appears to be quite high, right? So you've almost got like sort of plutocracies sort of growing, right? And you've got like sort of family empires. I mean, some of the biggest billionaires in the world are Indian, and most of their money is in London. And I respect that India has grown. Of course, the common man in India is definitely better off than they were 15 years ago. Do you see a problem with that? Do you see anything in India happening that will at some point redistribute some of that wealth somehow? Or because the reason why I asked that question is because what Eric just mentioned, billionaires may not spend more money on more cars, but they will affect democracy.
So I think that's an excellent question. I think, first of all, I don't think most of Indian billionaires' money is in London. It's a very small amount. Just for the record, I know London gets very happy with all kinds of money from Russia and Saudi Arabia. Most of Indian money is actually in India, and very voluntarily so. So in India, we are basically, as I mentioned, we're in the process of creating a modern state. And a modern state means you need to have some version of meritocracy as opposed to some kind of feudal plutocracy. And I think in India, compared to say 10 years ago, how close you are to the government in terms of you getting economic advantage matters less. I'm not saying it does not matter at all. One of the reasons why emerging markets have conglomerates is because all kinds of administrative and bureaucratic handling can be done in a centralized office along with capital allocation, right? But in India, it seems to be on the downside. So in terms of any kind of cronyism, whether we call it crony capitalism or crony socialism, whatever, that is on the down. Now it's not zero. Now, in terms of ideas, actually, surprisingly, Indian billionaires have not invested in any kind of ideas. So again, it's a very Western construct of like George Soros on the left and the Koch brothers on the right, and that's not true in India. In India, because historically, partially because the older generation is still so scarred from the earlier license Raj control days, that they don't come out politically taking very strong philosophical views. That does not mean that there is not funding of political parties. There's a lot of non-transparent funding of political parties, but even that has now been happening through what in India is known as white money versus black money, whatever I don't know why the connotations of what they are, but in terms of money which has already paid tax on, now that is being transferred to political parties, but there's still not full disclosure. So there is like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but on the whole, it's going forward. More fundamentally, I don't think inequality per se is that big a problem. Again, social mobility is. I think the legitimacy of the system in terms of the common man is a bigger issue. I don't think there are many people in Indian slums who worry about how much money Ambani has. I've heard different things about, for example, if you walk through Brazilian cities, it's not safe, like favelas and all that, but it's absolutely not the case in Indian slums and villages. Now, you can have all kind of Orientalist explanations for that. Well, okay, well, that's because they're fatalists. That's because there is rebirth and caste and this and that. But honestly, I think people are so busy with getting better in their own lives that you really see all protests against inequality is by the elites. Almost all inequality, protests against the inequality is never by people on whose behalf it is spoken about. That it's much more topical for them. For example, in the US, the left side got so angry, they said, what's wrong with Kansas? And the right side got very angry saying, what's wrong with Connecticut, right? I mean, the idea was, why are the poor voting right and why are the rich voting left? But a human being has many other non-economic motivations. And one of the problems I have with this kind of inequality debate is it reduces everything to money. And in the modern age where there is a clear income leisure trade-off, I'm agreeing with a lot of what Eric is saying, as well as what everybody else has said. But I really think in India right now, the more important part is to get rich, and the turnover in the billionaires family, it's not kind of calcified yet. There are a lot of new age technology entrepreneurs who have these unicorns and billion-dollar valuations, at least on paper, even if they can't take the money out right now. So the system has legitimacy, and the perception of corruption and the actuality of corruption has reduced, but it's still not zero. Okay. So it can further improve, but it's gotten better.
Fantastic.
Would you mind if I come in here, Sachin?
Yeah, go for it, Jamie.
I think that part of the question here is about whether we want what you might call an administered solution to these problems. So, or whether we want a spontaneous one. By spontaneous, I mean not planned. Now, let's take, I'm finding actually the discussion of India much more interesting than of Britain, which I'm bored by these days. But anyway, let me just do Britain, because I know about Britain a bit. Take the wealth issue. So if you look at inequality, it hasn't really changed in incomes, but it has post-tax incomes, but it has changed in wealth. Eric's right about this. Why? Well, one of the big drivers of this has been housing policy in the United Kingdom. So houses have appreciated in value an awful lot over the last 30 years or something. They have also in my native New Zealand. Why? Well, one of the big reasons is that there are very restricted, it's very difficult to develop land for new residential property. And this means that there's a very restricted supply of housing in both countries. And this has driven the price up. And it means it's very difficult. It used to be in New Zealand, it used to be that you could buy, the average house was 3 times the average salary, annual salary. Now it's 10 times. So
I
of
think it was
course,
similar in the
young
UK.
people cannot.
I think it was similar in the
Young,
UK, right?
right, it is the same roughly, yeah. Young people can't get on the housing ladder, and they can't appreciate that was the main asset that most people had. And it's really changed society in profound ways. I think it's encouraged a lot of young people to become left-wing. But it is a result of an intervention by the state aimed at bringing about what they considered a desirable outcome. In fact, they were lobbied by people who already own homes, right? I mean, there's a NIMBYism, as it's known here, you know. And I get my instinct, and it's not just an instinct. I mean, I've studied it a bit, but it's an instinct. Is the answer isn't more administration. I've created a problem by not allowing people to do, by driving up the prices of houses. Now I'm going to remedy that problem by intervening in the economy in some other way. And we're just endlessly intervening to correct an error, a problem created by a previous intervention. And we should just stop imagining that there's this kind of technocratic elite class of people who can solve the problems of society by massive interventions in people's otherwise voluntary conduct.
Right. No, that message comes loud and clear, and that's kind of interesting. I want to move the conversation slightly further. You know, one of the things that I sometimes struggle with, and just so you know, for my sins, I read a lot of Eric Fromm. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Eric Fromm, right? But he was a psychoanalyst from the Vienna School. You can imagine what that's like. And a lot of his solutions to our current, you know, sort of societal issue, I think are redundant. I'm not going to bother with that. But his critique was really interesting. What he said is the problem with capital and capitalism broadly is that it reduces the individual into an automaton who just kind of thinks about consuming, right? Just consuming more. Yes, they innovate, absolutely, and all the rest of it. But two things happen. One is that innovation often alienates them completely, the individual, and then that individual becomes an automaton. And so what then happens is they no longer find any fulfillment in their jobs. So what they do is they look for fulfillment in sports or in drinking or in extramarital affairs. God knows what else, right? But something else happened. And he said something really interesting. He said the problem is that yes, you've got all this wealth, but the actual contentment levels, and what he called was mental distress. He said the mental distress of the average individual is much, much higher. So actually, you know, the question I want to ask all of you here is a little bit is you know, we've absolutely ascertained, right? It's a powerful system. We've bootstrapped our way out of poverty and at the mercy of, you know, the whims of nature, and we're far more in control of our lives and our destiny. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the cave to live as a caveman or a hunter-gatherer, but there is something to be said about the discontent of life, especially where you've got, now Harsh, in India, I get it, there is a real excitement, there is optimism, there is enthusiasm, and you know, absolutely, and I'll come to India in a minute, but just for Eric and Jamie to reflect on this a little bit. Was Eric Fromm right? I mean, are we seeing some of this now, that people are just fed up of, you know, more consumption? We've become consumers instead of citizens, right? Adam Smith says something similar, right? That capitalism ought to allow the human being to desire more and more greater desires, like higher pleasures. Those higher pleasures would be satisfied by the market. And therefore the human society keeps on progressing. What seems to be happening though is we've consumed and now we've become consumers and we've diminished and our pleasures have become somehow more base and the market seems to be satisfying those. I mean, just some reflections on that. Eric, do you want to come in?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I actually think this relates to the previous conversation. So what I found very intriguing, both what Jamie and Harsh were saying is, you know, in a sense, I'm not really interested in who's been arguing about inequality or where the narrative has come from. But what I found interesting in both of their remarks is it's a self-evident truth that the outcome would be better if it was a more even distribution, right? Because it's very clear from what Harsh is saying is that you don't want to be in a slum. right? You want to be in better circumstances, which effectively means, yeah, if you could take those people out of the slum and have them in a middle-class district, you'd prefer that was the case, right? And to Jamie's point, Jamie's really just arguing about the means. So in his perspective, a lot of the wealth inequality, I don't know if it's empirically the case, is due to housing in the UK, and you could solve that with providing more supply of land through removal of regulations. My view of this is, what's interesting to me is that this all takes for granted, because it is a kind of self-evident truth, that if we can have broader ownership of assets, better levels of income, people will be better off, right? And this does relate to these issues of quality of life, because I think there's a fundamental tension in the free market capitalist system, which is that a system that is premised on growth, premised on productivity growth, premised on innovation, premised on change, is that it creates a huge amount of uncertainty in daily lives. And actually, human beings crave certainty. And so there is a fundamental sort of existential tension. It's much more complex than I'm portraying it. But if you look, for example, at the increase in, there's almost a mental health epidemic across much of the developed world. And I think it would be naive to think that there aren't aspects to do with technology and the economic environment that don't contribute to those. So the economic system doesn't care if you're happy or not. Neither does technological innovation. If you give teenagers mobile phones, Apple doesn't check beforehand whether that'll improve their sense of contentment or well-being.
Correct, right? And Eric,
the evidence is overwhelming. If you look at the introduction of television in America, which they were able to analyze well because it came state by state, it made people very dissatisfied with their circumstances. So my point about solving the problems that I described is really about giving people a deeper sense of ownership, a sense that we can actually mitigate some of the brutal costs, particularly caused by recession. We can create an optimism about the future in terms of solving the challenges of global warming. But I think with the challenge with the distribution of wealth in particular, income, it depends where you are. I mean, income distribution in Europe matters far less than America, because the most important things in our lives are actually already provided for by free, which is education, healthcare, and significantly, to a much more significant sense, the access to housing is much better in much of Europe. But in particular, healthcare and education.
Okay.
But the point about wealth is, if you have the protection of assets, you're able to embrace with a much higher degree of confidence the extent of the uncertainty that is being created in the economic system.
Sure. No, I understand. Okay, wonderful. So the solution there is actually give people more ownership, give them more buy-in into the overall pie, right? And we're going to build conduits to allow that to happen. And it may not need to be from the state per se, but certainly they're an actor that possibly could. Jamie, just on that, I mean, is society alienated from itself, and therefore we're getting tribalism, nationalism, unhappiness, and all of it? And if that is the case, is it about lack of education, a breakdown of family? What's going on?
Well, this is a very big question. Let me start by saying that I think we must avoid being nostalgic about poverty. When you are a subsistence farmer, you wake up every morning and you know what you've got to do. You've got to scratch a living out of the dirt. And so you don't have many existential questions. You don't wonder, what should I do with my time? What's the point of it all? And so on. You know what to do. And as you get richer, you can ask more questions and you can do this, and that can kind of create anxieties and trouble. So it's true that there are all sorts of, there's this expression first world problems, or rich, and I think that's a real phenomenon, but we ought to take it as the joke it is. I mean, these are good problems to have. I can't choose, where should I go on holiday? Should I go to Spain or Greece? It's making me so nervous, So there's an element of that. But I do think, more seriously, I think that in the West, and I think it's coming everywhere, we've gone through not just enormous economic progress, but revolutionary social change in the last century. Just think about the relationship between men and women. I mean, it's utterly transformed. So women now play a totally different role in society from the one they did 100 years ago. That's nothing in historical terms, 100 years. These are transformative changes, and we haven't adapted to them perfectly. We don't quite know how to order our lives in ways that are, I don't know, that make us happy. The internet, which Eric brought up, so I mean, I absolutely agree with him. It has terrible psychological effects, especially on teenage girls, and we haven't learned how to manage that. But it's so new. I mean, it's 10 years ago, no one had a mobile phone. Well, not nobody, but no one had a smartphone. Now everyone's got a smartphone. So we are going through a period of extreme social change very rapidly, and I think there's a lot of unhappiness around it. But again, I don't want somebody to try and fix it from the outside. We have to just learn. We have to adapt to it.
Sure. Would you then just say that actually what we're experiencing is that innovation causes disruption, right? And we've innovated our world in the last 20, 30 years so much that naturally the fabric of our society somehow is being altered, right? Would you say these are teething pangs that we're all going through, right? Harsh?
No, look, okay, this is
Jamie,
very deep stuff. I'll do it very quickly.
Okay, go for it.
It could just increase, and it could be the point. So it might be that change accelerates, and humans cannot cope with the pace of it. But then what you do is you will react to that. You'll opt out. I mean, a lot of people are trying to opt out. So again, I don't think we want to organize the response. People will come up with something.
Got it. Okay. Harsh, thoughts?
Sure. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot to unpack here. I think a large part of the ennui, or like rising up the Maslow's pyramid and not finding enough answers, is partially because the West is in a post-Christian world. And, the young are increasingly giving survey answers that majority, or at least plurality, is non-denominational, not just in a Christian sense, but they don't affiliate with any religion. And, in many ways, the new woke religion is a religion that we are seeing on campuses and social media. And part of it is what Jamie mentioned: people can't get on the property ladder, and it's because interest rates are rising. There's a very interesting book which just came out on the second point on the economic side. So I don't want to psychoanalyze too much on the NOE side, because I think that's a completely different discussion. There's a book which came out by by Michael Pettis, Trade Wars or Class Wars. He's co-authored it, and I think it's a very good book. It kind of speaks to Eric's point that there's a lot of inequality, and because the poor have higher marginal propensity to consume as opposed to the rich, because some kind of free distribution would get us out of this secular stagnation. And especially this needs to happen more in Germany and China, which are basically kind of surplus nations. Although what is left unsaid is that might lead to more inequality in the UK and US, which are deficit nations. And what I mean by that is, how do you come out where you have more demand? Like in the 80s, we had a supply side revolution, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. Right now we have secular chronic overcapacity across the world, which is why core inflation is low. So now you need demand boost. And you've already taken interest rates down to zero, which ironically in turn has led to more inequality because of asset price inflation, housing inflation, so on and so forth. And therefore the middle class and the poor can't sell more debt. I think the only thing they can sell more is maybe some kind of human capital contracts, income share agreements. And if you think about it, progressive income tax is already kind of a human capital contract. So what the Western governments are saying, if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you want to take risk with your capital, you'll have lower taxes. But if you are a bloke in an office earning slightly more than the per capita income, you'll end up paying almost half of your income as taxes, which is in a way kind of getting back the university that is given to you free and the schooling that is given to you free. So what I'm trying to say is there's not much left for the middle class and the poor to sell anymore in terms of implicit human capital or debt. And we can only increase productivity, which is why I like Eric's point of the Green New Deal, even though he didn't use those words, even though AOC is saying it in the US, and they're all kind of crazy leftist ideas along with this very good idea. And there's a lot of poke barrel politics there. But broadly, with such low interest rates, We need to have more investment, which will get productivity up for everybody. That's the only way to square the circle. And the final point I'll mention here is, one kind of small innovation or a random idea that came to me is, why can't we have something like 401ks in the UK, in India, et cetera, et cetera? We have the NPS in India, where the government gives you leverage without a margin, without a mark-to-market margin. The reason why real estate makes money for middle classes is there is no mark-to-market margin call. If you could give me that in equity.
What do you mean by that? Well, Harsh,
what I mean by that is, let us say if I buy a house at $100,000, I put $20,000 down, 80,000 is what I need to pay. If next year the house goes to $70,000, I'm $10,000 underwater, but so long as I'm paying my mortgage, I don't lose the house. But that does not work with investment loans, except in a few very small countries.
Can I come in here just 1 second? I don't know if Mark Blythe and I have written about this, but the idea of setting up national wealth funds, which is precisely what you've described. So for example, the UK government, all governments across the developed world today can issue debt at close to zero nominal interest rates for 20 years. So if you imagine that's a mortgage and you could do a zero coupon, in other words, you don't have to repay anything for 20 years and you pay zero interest. That means if you invest in a global diversified portfolio of assets that generates anything like a positive return, you've created value. So what we're proposing is do 10 to 30% of GDP, issue 20-year debt at zero interest rates, and then give it to the private sector, run it properly like a sovereign wealth fund, which Singapore has been able to do if you like Singapore. If you like Scandinavia, Norway's been able to do it. You generate a 4 to 6% return, distribute ownership in it today, and come back in 20 years and see what it's worth. I think the global capitalist system has generated what it has for centuries, which is going to be a 4 to 6% real return. You'll have 30% of GDP in assets, and you'll have zero debt.
Harsh,
no, I agree with that. I think it's inevitable. I think more and more Western nations, non-Western nations, will have some kind of sovereign wealth funds, and even the individual saving accounts will have some kind of mortgage built in. And I think it's, and personally,
you give ownership. The point here is that not only do you give people a sense that they're participating in the system, they're sharing in the ownership and sharing in the success of the system, but you give them a safety net. They can, through time, that will accumulate value. You have something that you can draw down either for retirement or potentially for housing. You talk about young people and the need for assets. That could be done within 3 to 6 months across the developed world. And you could give 30% of GDP effectively. Obviously, that depends on what your returns are over the medium term.
Yes.
You could immediately give them a stake.
I think it's coming to it.
Yeah, I think it's bound to happen. I think even from an investment point of view, which is one of the reasons I think the equity risk premium is going to go down, is because these ideas like sovereign wealth funds or like broader ownership. Margaret Thatcher gave broader home ownership. And I think the next step for the Conservative or Liberal Party in the UK and elsewhere is to give broader equity ownership, because there are basically two kinds of people now who have equity exposure and who don't have equity exposure. And those who don't have equity exposure often have credit card debt exposure. And they have like 25, 30% annualized debt payments when interest rates are zero, because effectively those who pay on time, they get all those free points. So we are basically running payday loans for the bottom 50% of the population. 30, 40% in the middle is kind of flatlining, and the top 10% is basically because of luck or birth or just their smarts are accumulating more and more. And we have to somehow broaden the system without that necessarily being called socialism. And I agree with Eric, we need to think out of the box to that extent.
Excellent. Really, really interesting stuff. Jamie, do you want to reflect on something what you just heard from Eric and Harsh? Or will you allow me to move on? You're on mute. You're on mute. You're on mute, Jamie.
Sorry, I was just going to say that I think that there's a mistake here around financial versus real assets, and some, I'm not as happy about these ideas as Eric and Marsha, but I can't give a lecture on that now, so we'll move on.
But in one sentence, tell me why you're not happy. One sentence.
Well, I don't want, I think that capital should be directed, its use should be directed by people who have a stake in it. That's to say, it's their capital, and if they make a bad investment, they'll pay a price. I don't like politicians directing capital. So the idea that we have these massive sovereign wealth funds funded by government debt, I find, I mean, I understand, I think the benefits pointed to are right, but I think there's a naivety here about politics. And so I don't want the state to control increasingly large portions of the capital on Earth.
Okay, that's interesting. Right, I want to move on to something, just move on to two things. One is, we are now living in a world where some conglomerates and some private institutions, are more powerful than some nation states, right? Right? I mean, some of these organizations, some of the tech platforms, they can literally rewrite the rule book on liberal democracy, right? And in terms of what's happening with that. What role has the economy got? I'm just trying to understand this, because if we leave it the way it is and say, hey, it's laissez-faire, off we go, and I'm not necessarily suggesting any sort of state intervention per se, but there is something to be said, surely, isn't it? That a few shareholders sitting in, I don't know, Texas or California can dictate the affairs of a major conglomeration that can shake up Nigeria, or that can really shake up the Middle East, if so they chose to, or if they so voted to. I mean, do we have any concerns on the panel about the size and power of some of these organizations? And I'll open that up to any of you. Harsh, go first.
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, I have strong concerns because the economics of these Silicon Valley firms are winner takes all, or in economic jargon, it's positive network externalities, and therefore the larger you are, the larger you become. And in a way, what the Chinese did was they had this great internet firewall. They had other political reasons as well in terms of censorship, and they didn't Xi Jinping to recall something, et cetera, but they basically innovated, to Eric's point, because they basically were protectionist to begin with. And now, because of the Indo-China tensions right now, India has banned ByteDance and TikTok and 58 of the apps. And just today, we've put a 2% kind of digital tax on other internet companies, basically American ones. And what happens is, for very large countries, they become kind of like their own planets with their own gravitational pull. And either you are kind of dinner on this digital high table, or you are one of the eaters. And you're one of the people who are having dinner. And I think it is, for example, Twitter has been labeling Donald Trump's tweets. Whether you're pro Donald Trump or anti Donald Trump, nobody can say there is a clear objective reason why that happened, because many other such tweets were not labeled. And there's a lot of pressure on Facebook to boycott some advertisers. And basically the whole thing is getting politicized because of alleged fake news and Russian interference and Chinese interference. So there is no way these platforms can run objectively. And for India, even though we are friends with the Western liberal democracies, we cannot have all our data on Western servers. 1.4 billion people are not going to become a digital colony. This time not of the UK, but of the US. So there needs to be active industrial policy. I'll say the word, this is a kind of bad word, about the internet, because the status quo, this is path dependent. Like when Amazon comes to India, it has $1.35 trillion market capitalization. That's like 20% less than the entire Indian market's capitalization. Therefore, there is nothing called fair when you bring that kind of capital.
So what do you see happening? What do you do? What do you do about that, right?
So I think the large countries will have to basically have their own champions. And in fact, if you think about it, the European Union is doing it. The European Union, there was a fraud case there recently. One of the reasons why it was not discovered was because the antitrust authorities of the European Union have been going easy on the domestic companies to create their own national, or I suppose continental champions. And therefore, you will have to have some kind of combination of protectionism and industrial policy to make sure that, listen, it's not a meritocracy if everything ends up in California. And no matter how we spin it, that's not going to be allowed.
Right.
There will be a give and take. We might allow that for some time, but for example, if with augmented reality and virtual reality, if a lot of new kind of outsourcing happens to India, and a future American president says that's not good, we're going to clamp down on that, well, then we'll start clamping down on some American digital companies.
Understood.
So use that as a card for quid pro quo.
Which is interesting, right? So I mean, this is kind of interesting because now what you're suggesting there is that actually, you know, the nation state is going to have to start propping up and start building up its own corporate vehicles that can also compete on the global world, which is interesting, right? I mean, Eric, I want to jump in here. What do you do about this? It's a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have. For me, it's all a lot more complex than this. And I think if you take the media, for example, the media has become a lot more competitive due to technological change than it was. So if you look historically, if you went back 40 or 50 years, most people accessed information about their society or news through maybe an option of 3 or 4 newspapers. They probably had a local newspaper and a national newspaper. The controllers of those forms of media had huge influence. And since then, largely because of technological change, you've now got something approximating a much more competitive marketplace, which has both good and bad consequences, right? Because unfortunately, you can't really apply economics to news and knowledge in quite the same way as you. So if you think it's clearly better to have competition in the provision of vehicles, for example, so you have better choice and there's competition, that's good, and you get innovation. It's not at all clear what happens with ideas and whether ideas. So I think the incentive structure now of the media, if you move from an environment where I'm in a sense, I have some degree of monopoly power, and the role of the media is an interesting question when you have monopoly media. What is the role of the BBC, or what is the role of the national television station? Versus what is the role of an internet media company that just needs to get as many eyeballs as possible? They will quite likely move towards tribalism. I suspect that's
right,
or at
which
least
is what
you
we're
just
seeing.
end up with a purely commercial objective. So I think it's a very, very complex issue.
Okay.
I don't think there's a simple and straightforward answer to it. The only thing I would say on the positive side, look, we need to be careful about any vast concentration of wealth or power, right? Because it's fundamentally undemocratic, and it's fundamentally
we're going to have to solve
abuse.
this, right? We're going to have to solve it in the next.
If you have companies that are too big, wealth concentrated in too few hands, too powerful a country, too powerful an institution within a country, you always need to be careful, because power corrupts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's anti-democratic. Okay.
Jamie,
when I look at the world at the moment, I actually think most of these spheres have got high degrees of competition. So I'm fundamentally eclectic. We need checks and balances.
Sure.
So
no, I
come with a predisposition. I think a national wealth fund would actually be a check on lots of other. It would be a shareholder and a stakeholder, like lots of others, competing with lots
Eric,
of others.
just 1 minute. I'm just going to bring some of the others in here, right? So, Harsh, I know I see your hand up. Jamie, are you dying to say something?
I'm not dying.
Do you want to come in on this conversation?
There's this strange idea that you can trust the government to solve the problem. So what is the problem, right? So I've got
power is concentrated in really, really small hands, right? A small number of people.
Well, they are, and I know that these are network type businesses, and therefore scale is very important. And so you might say they're difficult to compete with, but some of them have already. There was one from a few years ago. I can't remember its name. It was the big deal. It was something called MySpace or something. It's disappeared. IBM's no longer a very big deal. Everyone thought it was totally dominant. I mean, they do come and go. Parler, there's something called Parlay, which has started up recently, which is kind of trying to compete with Twitter. And if Twitter gets to be, let's say, they start banning too many people, they start trying to constrain debate, and a lot of people will shift. And so I would much rather let the market mechanism deal with these problems than to invite the government to set up a ministry of truth and tell us what we can and can't hear on these platforms and which one. In Germany, I think there's the law that if something rude is said on your platform, something the government doesn't want said on your platform, it'll be taken to a judge, and the judge can find the platform guilty of this crime, some kind of speech crime, and the fine is 50 million euros. I mean, this is a preposterous intervention in free expression.
I get your point.
I just don't trust the political process as much as my co-panelists seem to.
Yeah. Okay, Harsh, go on. You had something to say.
No, I mean, listen. I mean, my default setting is libertarian. I mean, I've grown up in the communist-ruled state of West Bengal in India, so I understand entirely Jamie's point. It's just that I don't necessarily trust somebody else's political process, because in the case of Facebook or Twitter or Google, it's not India's political process; it's the United States political process. And for me, it's kind of difficult to kind of take it as a fait accompli that this is these network scale economies, and therefore it can't really be easily replaced, and therefore that's perfectly okay. Now that doesn't mean I think we should have protectionism against these companies on day one, for various reasons, because there might be an organic challenger. India and America are close friends, not yet allies. I might have a different opinion or a harsher opinion, pardon the pun on my name, with China. But with respect to the US, I do think it should be held as a bargaining tool if there are any kind of future protectionism by a future American president, or this president if he gets reelected, on some other kind of Indian products. Because ultimately technology and trade policy are a feature of the state. And the state was formed for policy regarding trade and war, historically, if you go to European, like pre-Westphalia and so on and so forth. So the idea that this should not be a tool, I think would be a bit naive. I do think it's much more complex, as Eric rightly mentioned, that there is a lot of competition in ideas, and you should not police that. But it's not just ideas. There is massive market cap behind this. There's a lot of wealth creation behind this, which is now headquartered in New York and not in Bangalore and Mumbai.
Okay.
And there's a danger of kind of denying a problem exists, right? Because it's a hard problem to solve.
Sure.
I wish I could just say,
Eric,
don't regulate anything. But the problem is, you've got regulations. The question is, do you want to have good ones or bad ones?
Sure.
It is regulated.
Right. We've now got the audience, and they've been waiting patiently for it. So I've got some questions streaming in here, Jamie, here's one for you, right? Just very briefly, because I'm conscious of time, guys. Yeah. We have eaten up our time. How do you enshrine, and the word used is enshrine, how do you enshrine a system that is conducive to facilitating long-term innovation? And I'm going to add the word investment, right? Long-term innovation and investment. And this is from a lady I suspect called Latia. So
I'm very glad that question's come up. So I think that one thing I didn't mention, which is vital, especially for long-term investment and innovation, is the rule of law. So what I mean, people need confidence that the terms under which they make their investments are not going to be arbitrarily changed. Otherwise, why would you do it, right? You've got to feel confident about that. And one of the ways in which, oddly enough, democracy sometimes works against the rule of law is that you get ever-changing kind of priorities from different politicians coming in, and they fiddle with things, and that they undermine that. And in fact, one interesting feature of some trade deals of recent years, that what they used to call the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was that they had that rule saying that if the government changes the rules and in a way that adversely affects a foreign investor company, that foreign investor company can sue the government. This was part of the deal. It caused outrage in my native New Zealand when this was brought out, but I actually thought it was a great idea because it was an attempt to provide that certainty about the rule of law that would encourage long-term investment.
Excellent. Very, very, very succinct answer. Okay, we have another question. Harsh, this one is for you, and it's specifically India related. What is the future of protectionism in India? For example, in the automotive arena, and protectioning to do with export market, so basically she's talking about, specific sectors, but actually is India still going to remain protectionist? I know it's becoming less protectionist, but what does the future look like? That's from somebody called Mansa.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. So basically from 1991 till about 2016, 17, we dramatically reduced import duties across the board. It's only in the last couple of years, maybe 2-3 years, that we've actually started gently increasing tariffs. Auto tariffs were always high, relatively, We've now started increasing tariffs on electronics, for example, smartphone components, so on and so forth. And the idea there is, well, given that China is 10 times your manufacturing base, 5 times larger economy, 2 times larger manufacturing as a share of GDP, 5 into 2, 10 times with all the economies of scale, you need to kind of play off your domestic market to get in foreign investment. So this is not autarky. You're not saying no to any kind of FDI or technology, as we did in our last attempt at import substitution and protectionism in the 70s, when we kind of kicked out Coca-Cola, etc. This is about everybody who wants to make manufacture in India, please come in. We are trying to work on the labor laws and land laws. Gently, some progress is happening. We've actually gently depreciated in real terms the rupee, and right now we have more than $500 billion in reserves. So the idea is, to kind of, this is a classic Danny Roderick point of view on how do you kickstart manufacturing exports. So I think India is, once you develop state capacity and some trust in the state to be somewhat of an honest arbiter, some kind of industrial and trade policy is happening. But I don't think India will ever go too far with it. It will remain by and large a free market state. But the unique case of China has forced us to take these kind of steps. Just as a point of view, like quickly, when we joined WTO in the 90s, we signed something called the ITA, Information Technology Agreement. And all electronic tariffs went to zero on day one. And by the end of the 1990s, we had lower value add in that sector by the end of the decade as we had at the beginning of the decade. Whereas for automobiles and auto ancillaries, we had import tariffs, but we had full FDI come in. And today, India is one of the success stories for autos and auto ancillaries. Right. And that shows that for large countries in the right kind of, because of this kind of quasi-monopsony power, smart protectionism can sometimes work, but you have to be careful.
Right, but it's kind of graded, right? You're kind of grading it through. Yeah. Okay, understood. Eric, here's one for you. It's come from a chap called Yajur Shah, and it's around the environmental, social governance stuff, investments. He's saying ESG investment can happen when funds can measure the ESG risk return profile in a credible way. What is the measurable that allows investors to quantify the risk return? Right, like
it's a complex question.
Basically asking, is there a credible way?
What I would say is that, I mean, this is again in the area of kind of global corporate governance that I think is very, very encouraging. So I think there's an extraordinary shift in culture in the behavior of global corporations to take into account environmental and social governance. And it's a very, very deep cultural change that's occurring within the private sector. And it is being motivated by a combination of the fact that they're human beings who live in communities and care about how they're going to be perceived, care about how their children perceive them, care about how their peers perceive them. But they're also being affected by shareholders and the dynamics on the secondary market. And I think everybody is grappling. There are big challenges of measurement, but they're no greater a challenge of measurement than any other measurement challenge that we face. I think it would be premature to draw conclusions about the risk properties. Some of the evidence so far suggests actually there are assets that have performed relatively well from a risk perspective, but I mean, I wouldn't, from a proper statistical standpoint, I wouldn't give that a lot of credence.
Yeah. Okay.
But I don't think it's a problem at all. I think it's a genuinely positive development, which I think will accelerate. Okay. And it's one of those examples where, economics always assumes your preferences are given. Your preferences aren't given. Your preferences are subject to cultural shifts. And in a sense, markets try to find solutions subject to your preferences. And this is an area where the preferences of everybody, frankly, within the world are shifting on the issue of the environmental and social effects and governance issues, and it's changing.
Okay, really quickly, here's another quick question for maybe all of you guys to reflect on very quickly for me, okay? And I want really quick answers, if you can. Can we still rely on our liberal democracies to to kind of maintain the underpinning legal structure upon which trade is built, right? With the kind of growth and emergence of China, with a very different model, with what you see, what's happening in the kind of mercantilism that China's practicing around the world, do we think our liberal democracies, which I would say, haven't fared very well in the last 10, 15 years, right? But will they maintain and will they provide the leadership and the stability in the rule of law, especially when we move into a tripolar world, right? Or at least a bipolar world, where you've got three very different actors, right? You've got the US, China, and in the middle somewhere you've got India, right? Which has its own cultural nuances and its own appetite and its own way of doing things. So very briefly, do we think that the liberal Western democracies, or at least liberal democracies, will stand up to this scrutiny over the next couple of decades? And each of you, just quick, brief answers. Harsh, you go first, then Jamie, then Eric.
I'm absolutely optimistic about the democratic model prevailing going forward. I think the people are realizing that they've made a mistake in terms of letting the Chinese develop economic sinews of power, which they're now using, misusing, abusing in various ways. I don't think that's entirely irreversible. What we will require is an explicit coming together of democratic states to trade with each other and just kind of have more of an arm's length distance, a higher wall, so to speak, to jump for commerce with China, without completely isolating it, because completely isolated China is also dangerous. But it will have to have higher friction with the out group, that is countries like China, as opposed to the in group. And I think there is, again, democracy, to quote Churchill again, I have many issues as an Indian with Churchill, but he's extremely good with quotes. So democracy is the least of the worst systems, the least bad of the worst systems.
Thank you very much. Jamie, quick thoughts. You're on mute. Jamie, you're on mute.
I agree that democracy in this broad, it's a very broad term. And I agree, if it's taken to entail not just majoritarianism, not just that way of getting a government, but a whole lot of the other institutions, then I agree entirely with Harsh that it's the best system that we have and that it ought to see us through these times. My worry is that in Britain, at least, and the United States to some extent, I think we're at a different stage in development from India. India is going through, we're almost in the decadent stage, you might say, of democracy, not the teenage, virile stage. And I fear that there is a kind of political contempt almost for some of the institutions, like the rule of law, that is arising in Britain and the United States. And I'm concerned about it. I actually don't think it'll affect international trade especially. I think it affects other things, but I can't get into that.
Okay.
But we're in late stage democracy, I think. India's an early stage democracy, and I think there's more reason to be optimistic there in some ways than here.
That's interesting. Okay, Eric, very briefly, and then I'm going to get you to start making some closing remarks.
I'm optimistic in the sense because I think we could well be at a crossroads. And I think what is easy to forget is the extent to which effectively nations and ideas are in competition with each other. And one of the positive effects of communism was it actually forced the capitalist system to reform itself. Because part of the world realized that if we didn't make capitalism work for most people, we could just look across the country and see what the alternative was. And I actually think one of the I don't believe in predictions or forecasting, so it comes with that caveat. But one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic may well be, I actually think it's almost blindingly obvious, the relative successes of the Chinese state relative to ours, and I'm generalizing vastly. But if you look both at how they control the pandemic with extraordinary abruptness, and they've engineered their own economic recovery with a far, far faster trajectory than us, it's too stark to be ignored. And so I think the West, to generalize, the developed world faces two dilemmas. One is we've got serious competition because it's not at all obvious now that our model is superior. If anything, our model is inferior. And the other thing is we're tearing ourselves apart politically with an age-old and highly destructive, primitive set of instincts, which is tribalism. So tribalism has hijacked our politics in a totally dysfunctional way. So we really need the reforms I've been describing, which is we need to prove that our system can actually dramatically improve society for the benefits of the overwhelming majority, and it can do it pretty quickly, because otherwise we're going to get shown up from two fronts in pretty stark terms.
That's fantastic. Really, really good summary there of your position. I think there's a lot to be said about that. Jamie, just final 2 minutes, sort of wrap up from you. You've obviously been an advocate of free markets, and you kind of mentioned a little bit about democracy kind of waning, and I want you to kind of make some concluding remarks about this. Look, how do we, in a world such as this, over the next, say, 2 decades, how do we maintain that markets remain liberal and democracy remains vibrant? How do you revitalize this aging democracy in your language? Just 2 minutes, very quickly, and these are the kind of take-home messages. Right?
The source of the erosion has, I think, been that people lobby the government for favors, and they ask for various interventions that will benefit them. And this has been going on and on and on now. And of course, this is one of the problems about very powerful corporations and so on, that they interfere in the political process in this way. And used to be the idea in the United States was that the protections against this were constitutional. So the constitutional limited the role of the government to do things like this. But of course, over time, a series of court cases, Supreme Court cases, undermined the Constitution's role in doing that. And I think that the answer, there's no trick here. If the population doesn't believe in free markets, doesn't believe in the rule of law, wants a government that is actively involved in administering favors for various groups, if that's what the population wants in a democracy, that's what they'll get. So I've devoted a lot of the last 15 years of my life to trying to get people to think differently. If they don't think differently, I'm going to lose. And to be honest, I'm very pessimistic. I mean, I've totally failed, and so have the people who work with me. And we are an increasingly tiny minority, the people who share my beliefs.
Well, that's very, very striking and clear. Harsh, final 2 minutes, and for you, just kind of again wrapping this up a little bit for you. Look, we've talked a lot about sort of, and you've very, very nicely, very adequately brought in the Indian story into the global picture. But look, what kind of leadership, if any, can India really give to this sort of global structure, especially if it becomes a tripolar world? What sort of leadership can you expect from India and from an economic perspective? Final 2 minutes.
So I think I'm extremely bullish both globally and especially on India. India is going to have around 1.6 billion people by around 2050. And I think once you do any kind of per capita convergence scenario, standard, more bullish, slightly less bullish, you can do the math. And I personally think, according to, it will be probably the world's largest economy by the middle of the century, if not latest by the second half of the century. And I think the leadership will be that India will largely work in the current international model. It is not a revisionist power in terms of the international order. It's very happy to strengthen the current order in terms of trade, in terms of economics, as you mentioned. However, for that to happen, we have to understand that economics is political economy. It's part of a larger context. And if there are powers like the Chinese, because remember, the Soviet Union was not part of the global commercial system in the last Cold War. In this Cold War, we are deeply integrated. So how do we kind of keep China in while still having a certain penalty for them not being democratic in terms of economics? And I think India will provide a very strong leadership in that. And I think we're already seeing very early signs of that in the pandemic. And finally, I think one thing which will help India going forward also kind of relates to the London real estate point that Jamie mentioned. In the pandemic, so many of us are already working from home, right? This conference is happening virtually for the first time. And if it can happen, if I can be sitting in London and you can be sitting in London, then I can be sitting in London and I can be sitting in Lucknow. I could be in any corner of the world. And the cost of living is so dramatically different across the world. I mean, I don't want to go into technicalities about Balassa, Samuelson, and so on and so forth. There is that the scope of convergence because of that has massively accelerated because habits have changed. And therefore, within the UK, for example, people in Manchester and the northern areas, people could be living there and working in London, coming once a week. The same thing could happen internationally. The same thing could happen within India. And I think that would create much more wealth because cost of living would go down. And I think so. That's why I'm bullish on. And what India will contribute would be to kind of form a league of democracies when it comes to economic matters.
Thank you very, very much. So all three of you, I want to thank you. So Eric Lonergan, Jamie Whyte, Harsh Gupta, thank you so much for taking part in this panel. Can you believe it? We've consumed 2 hours, and I'm sure we could talk for another 4 hours and just get warmed up. I'm sure of it, the kind of breadth that we've covered. Thank you so much for joining us. And to all of you watching, whether it's the morning, the afternoon, or like here in the UK, the evening, I want to thank you. I hope you found that very, very interesting. And as a chair, it's been a delight to be part of this panel. Thank you to Sustainable Narratives. I'm going to pass you on to Sapna Mavani, who will close our session, and she is a VM team member. Sapna.
Thank you very much to Sachin and to our panelists for sharing your expertise and experience. And thank you to you, our virtual audience. We hope you will continue this month in your own circles. I'm sure you will. If you would like to learn more about Vichar Manthan or support us by investing in ideas that matter, please visit vicharmanthan.org or click on the links below this video. We now have a 30-minute break prior to our fireside titled The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense, with Professor Gad Saad. Tomorrow is the final day of our inaugural conference, and we have a fantastic lineup for you with 1 fireside and 2 panel discussions. So, starting at 1 p.m. BST tomorrow, we will be joined by Sashi Tharoor, who will be discussing what the global order may look like in 2050. At 3 p.m. BST, our first panel discussion begins, titled Culture and Literature in a Postmodern World. This will then be followed by Can Rights Be Sustainable Without a Set of Duties? This is at 6 p.m. BST. Register below to join us tomorrow. We invite you now to take a short break and join us back here in half an hour for our last event of today, which is The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense, with Professor Gad Saad, starting at 8:30 p.m. BST. See you shortly.